for one, what the audience will never see is that I record in an area of my house that's a tiki bar, and there's lots of foliage, like fake palm trees and leaves and like that all around, all around me. But today, I'm wearing my
The
wife's
bathrobe.
fuzzy gray robe,
I wouldn't have even guessed it
and
was your wife's, and now that just adds another layer. Thank you for that.
you know what? I feel like it's appropriately unisex. And if it's not, I don't care because it's really comfortable. But I look like an Ecuadorian drug lord or something like that in camera right now. Because I'm reclined back with my robe on, with all the green foliage around me.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks, guys, for coming to listen to this conversation from the Voyage podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the Trickster, kind of giving a little bit of an introduction to the concept, and then we'll start to tie it into, because we're going to be doing a part 2, which will go into a lot of the biblical examples and things like that. But today, it's going to be all about the Trickster. Don't forget to, if you haven't already, like, subscribe to the podcast, leave a 5-star rating, leave a review that just kind of gets us out there more and more. And plus, then we can continue to support Jacob's lavish Ecuadorian drug lord lifestyle that he's grown so accustomed to.
The drugs only go so far.
That's
I need to diversify. So are we going to let the cat out of the bag that this is our first time attempting to re-record something because there was audio issues?
Yeah, so this is our Trickster part 1. Redo is the
It's called Redux, Mike.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
That's the English.
Just to be cultured there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just don't even know if I could pretend like this isn't just a re-recording. And
Look
frankly,
at you with the transparency.
You guys missed out on just one of the best episodes we're ever going to do.
That is
undoubtedly.
You know what? If we're talking about transparency, I have to point out that is not true. That was not.
No, shh. No, this was one for the books. This was the episode that was going to catapult us into the highest echelons of podcast stardom. And, God intervened and said, you guys need to learn humility.
Yeah.
And so, the Trickster episode played a trick on us.
Oh boy.
There was
plenty of those last time.
There was gremlins in the
so
audio equipment.
Well, anyway, with all that in mind, let's go ahead and move forward with. So, we mentioned, we're going to be doing a part
Mike?
2.
I'm pretty depressed about this.
Okay, well,
I really liked it. We talked about the Matrix. You guys like the Matrix?
In this one we did?
In this one, yeah, we did.
So
you guys like the Matrix? Because I bet you we don't talk about it again. You would have had to listen to the first episode.
You keep saying, yeah, it's like, these aren't even, you can't even call these teasers. So.
No, they're just me sharing my grief, all right? So if anyone listening, wants to sit with me in ashes, unlike my friend Mike, he wants to come to me and be all like, no, here's the reasons why you shouldn't be upset. And it's probably your fault.
That's another
and
pulling
I just
away.
want to sit there.
That's another pulling of the veil, right? Because it's Ash Wednesday as we record this.
Well, I wasn't, I wasn't sure because, yeah, I guess we could just admit that you got a bunch of stuff on your forehead. Yeah, why not? Why not? I wasn't sure if it's like, should we pretend like we're saying these things back in whatever January, whenever we recorded that? I guess it's too late now. We're definitely not recording in January.
Okay.
None of that matters, does it?
Thanks. That's a lot of good exposition. so much good exposition.
This is already such a worse episode than the last time. Let's go. Let's do this.
So the Trickster, when we refer to it as like its own thing, like the Trickster, we're talking about the trope, right? The mythological trope that you'll see, I mean, as we'll kind of go through our examples, because really this part one is going to be all about where we see this in ancient and modern secular mythology, right? And even calling it secular mythology is almost a misnomer, almost a contradiction. But
Hmm.
when we're talking like, non-Christian mythology, let's say, we have some ancient examples, we have some more modern examples, and we're going to kind of tie those together of what makes, what role does the trickster play is kind of what we want to establish, because what we will, or as you've generously pointed out, what we already have talked about in part two is how that
Very
those
eloquently.
same, those same tricksters play and fulfill that role even in the biblical narrative, even in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have tricksters, and they're following this same pattern, interestingly, with
Oh,
the
it
tricksters you'll find in the, like I said, quote unquote secular or non-Christian or biblical revelation
no, it's an
mythologies.
interesting conversation because I don't think that you think trickster and you have a very specific kind of concept in your mind. As far as I'm concerned, I have this kind of specific concept in my mind,
Yeah.
and I don't really equate it with biblical stories, right?
No, you wouldn't
It,
expect it.
it
That's
feels
the
like
yeah.
something, yeah, that's not. It's just not in the whatever mythology that I associate
Well,
with.
that's
And
just
again, we use mythology not in like a this means fake, but just in the way that stories influence our lives and
well,
things
and
like
that's
that.
just what sets us
Um,
apart, right? Is, we may do a basic Batman episode, but then we'll also hit you with this unexpected trickster episode.
Boom.
Yeah.
Yep. See, it's a trick to get you to listen
Oh,
to.
he's going meta again.
Yeah, I don't know. That didn't really kind of fell
So
flat.
so
Anyway,
the so obvious, like we've already kind of mentioned, the trickster
if I
as a
made that joke in the
concept.
first episode, the first time we did this, it would have landed. I would have
uh
done, you
I
know.
remember the first episode. It so as we talked about, these obviously predate Carl Jung. They happen in this ancient mythology, but why this is sometimes associated with Carl Jung, not just the trickster trope, but the mythological tropes in general, is so he was a psychologist. He was a student of Sigmund Freud, and he diverged. I mean, they kind of created these two different schools. You have the Freudian and the Jungian, and what's oftentimes associated with him when it comes to the kind of more psychological, like personality element, is fitting into these different tropes that he not only applied like in his kind of like modern like patients or clients or whatever, but you can see those in literature, right, or in mythology. And
Mhm.
so the trickster is just one of these examples, but there's a lot of examples. What's kind of the first one that comes to your mind, Jacob, when it comes to like the
Well,
trickster
before we get into
character?
it, I just want to say if you're going to lean into any discredited of the two, if
Yeah,
you're going to lean into either of these discredited psychologists, I highly recommend Carl Jung
over
because he's
Freud.
way funner. He's
Yeah.
way funner than Freud. Unless, I mean, I guess I should caveat that it depends upon what your definition of fun is, because you could probably find a lot of fun things in Freud if that's your cup of tea. Uh, so anyway, Carl Jung, he had a lot of fun things to say. I enjoy his train of thought. And it doesn't absolutely align with a lot of Christianity, but there's elements within it, just like what we're always kind of talking about on the show is there's there's always something that people outside of the church
Well,
identify as true.
and
Um,
another kind of to your point, actually. So a lot of people will sometimes talk about how Freud and Jung were neither of them were necessarily friendly to Christianity, right? They both had their sort of criticisms, but I think there's a lot more that the Christian can recognize as valuable or
yeah,
useful within the especially the tropes that we're going
Jung
to be
is
talking about.
Jung
Um,
is much more of an ally to a traditional Christian way of thinking than Freud is. I would say that Freud actually did a lot of damage to modernity's kind of like view of psychology, whereas Jung did not. And I joked and said that he was discredited. I I really just say that because people say he's discredited. And to some extent, I suppose I'm not an expert psychologist, so whatever. maybe he is. But I think that there's a lot of useful things
Well, no,
to.
and that's just it. Is like if you're only going to take it so far, you're not going to absolutize either one of them, right? Regardless of what you
Yeah,
find true in one or the other. But going again, continuing on with this idea of like, so we talked about the tropes and specifically the trickster, which is what we're going to be kind of laying out the foundation for here, and then we're going to tie into the more explicitly Christian, obviously when it comes to the Old Testament and New Testament. Um, but what were some of those, because why was he able to
yeah,
recognize these? What were some of these? So what's like the one that always, comes up first in your mind when it comes to a trickster character in mythology,
yeah. Well,
right?
I mean, if only because the Marvel Cinematic Universe has made him so prominent.
Yeah.
Loki is almost the kind of default.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess whatever, maybe 10 years ago you would have just went straight to Joker or something like that.
Okay.
But
Sure.
I think Loki has really kind of superseded as the kind of fundamentally archetypal trickster. Um,
And because Marvel has turned him into much more of a hero too, right? And that's probably why he is like part of the, you know,
yeah,
plays more of a role in the consciousness.
he has kind of a prominent role within the narratives being told within those stories, is what you're suggesting. And
Yeah.
that's probably true. I mean, Joker's a really good example of this as well, right?
Mhm.
Joker is unabashedly unrepentant and conniving. Loki is far more of a wild card. Is he going to be a good? Is he going to be an asset to saving the world or a detractor to saving the world?
Well, and
And
that's
that's
more
a little
like
bit more accurate, right?
that's more true to the trickster trope, right? Is that it's not meant to be moral or immoral. It's meant to be an amoral character. And on the surface that sounds like, well, doesn't that sound just as bad? Or isn't it? Well, it's that this trope becomes a mechanism for bad in various circumstances, but also for good, right? The trickster can
Hmm.
bring about a good end just as much as a bad end. And so
Well, I
that's
suppose,
what makes it, like you
yeah,
said,
the idea is that he's
unpredictable, or yeah,
like a catalyzing
a
force, right? Like,
catalyst for change. Yeah, we're
right.
gonna go into that definitely as we go through our, not like a formal definition by any means, but yeah. So Loki, I mean, that's
Do you want
that's
to go through just like what are some other like how about The Mask? Remember the
oh
movie The Mask?
oh yeah, that was very formative to my. I can't remember exactly the year, but I do remember I was elementary school, and
Let's hear
it is
The
fun to
Mask.
like.
I feel like that was 94.
It was,
I'm gonna
yeah, it was
guess
mid
94 on
'90s.
that. Yeah.
But
Um, that was really kind of Jim Carrey's breakout.
I think you're
I
right, and
mean,
I
I know that
think,
he was on In Living Color. Do I have any In Living Color fans in the
oh yeah,
audience?
I remember that one too.
Um, he's
That
so
was, for
young in
me, it
that.
was after the fact. It wasn't in the it was actually,
Yeah, you
so
had to discover that.
even if he
Wait,
had had
you
some
weren't
credits.
on like UPN at
Yeah.
10 o'clock at night watching In Living Color?
Was it
I'm not even
UPN?
sure what channel. I mean, I'm gonna
Yeah.
guess UPN.
Um,
I'm not even sure where it aired. I don't remember.
that reference deserves 2 snaps up. Uh, so yeah, what it
um,
was definitely, obviously, I mean, one of his early roles. I don't know if
yeah.
it was
Well, Jim
before
Carrey
Ace
was great
Ventura or
though.
not, but and it was the first, I think, huge role for Cameron Diaz too, which kind of put her onto stardom as well.
Yeah,
Um,
she was a good addition to that movie. That's all I'll say. The but Jim Carrey, no, that mask figure, he's a perfect example of this, right? Because he's
Definitely.
super ambivalent, super ambivalent.
Well, and in the
He
movie itself, in the story, it was the mask of Loki. It was
oh, it
representative
was
of
the mask
Loki.
of Loki.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
Loki
no
in the
kidding.
movie. So I think they're trying to like they're putting it on the nose a little bit too. But
Oh, I know. I guess that wasn't as far afield as I thought. All right, so let's all right, something not related to Loki. That's a trickster example. Let's see here.
well, like Hermes is probably the other, like, in terms of, I mean, not that he's necessarily the most well known as a trickster, but he is like, he's the other sort of trickster
well, I
god,
remember.
which,
Yeah, I remember the first time you brought up Hermes.
yeah, you
It's
wanted
like
to
I don't
fight
even
me
think
on
that's real.
this.
Yeah,
And
I was
then
like, he's not a
and then I
trickster.
was
What is he a
like,
trickster god
and
about?
it caught me off guard. I
Um,
wasn't expecting the pushback. And then it late, yeah.
you guys, you guys missed my frantically googling for examples.
I was like, what is this? I thought we were on the same team here. Uh,
No, but but it Hermes is evidently Hermes is an example from Greek literature about this. Um, but I'm hard pressed to find really good examples for Hermes.
He
Um,
stole Apollo's sacred cows. That's yeah.
ah, classic,
They're
classic
also
trickster
so it
right there.
actually one of the other stories too because so this is one of the things that whenever you hear about Pandora, it's always about Pandora's box, right? But there's actually a much deeper sort of mythology to her character as well. But one of the parts of her backstory is that she was taught cunning and deceit from Hermes. And so
Oh yeah.
and so I was almost
Hmm.
I almost wanted to find, I mean, this would have been like apocryphal or whatever, but I almost wanted to find like some story where like he convinced her to open the box or something. I was like, oh, how fitting would that have been? Because then you have very much a serpent tempting Eve. Uh,
Oh, that would have been really interesting,
and
actually. Yeah,
so I would
that
be
type of
curious if,
correlation.
and like I said, I didn't do like a ton of for all my frantic googling, Jacob, I didn't find an apocryphal story that actually makes that parallel. But it would be fitting if there was a sort of parallel, right? Because as we'll get into um in part two, the serpent plays that trickster role.
Well, no, that's actually what makes this such a weird conversation to record right now, is because here's the other thing, folks. We've already done the sequel to this conversation that did not have audio problems. And I'm trying to carefully not cover territory that we're going to cover next time and actually try to recollect the difference. Recollect what was talked about in this version and what's going to be talked about that we're not going to re-record because that one went
Our
off
producer
just
is
fine.
rolling his eyes so hard right now. I'm glad that he turned his
I
camera
think
off
that
because
I think that this type of honesty with the audience is where the loyalty comes from, Mike. You know,
yeah.
we're just a couple blue collar, dudes trying to make it in this podcasting landscape. We got a ways to go, but we're getting there. We're
I
gonna get there
wore
with your help.
I wore purple today
Send
because it's
send
Ash Wednesday.
donations to what'd you say?
I said I wore purple because it's Ash Wednesday.
Oh, nice. I mean, it's
So
not quite as a flare as my wardrobe, but
I should have worn
you know,
black, right, to remind myself that I'm dust, and to dust I shall return.
it's true. Or if you wore maybe like a green undershirt with your purple collared shirt, you could have been like a Joker reference for the
Oof.
Trickster
I
podcast.
gotcha.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we're not going to dwell on the one of the things that I did want to bring up Hermes for though, and I think again this sort of adds to another layer of irony to the trickster character is like we've already kind of talked about. Even if the first thought a person has of Hermes is that he's the trickster god, the other
Or
thing that
not.
he was known as was the messenger of the gods. And I
Yep.
thought,
Yeah,
how
that's kind of what I
ironic,
think
how
of.
fitting that you have this character who is not only the messenger, the one in charge of communication, but also the trickster, the one who will deceive or mislead or be this catalyst for change. And it very much they're tied together in the same person. And so
Hmm.
I think that speaks to something, that the Greeks understood, or the ancient Greeks understood psychologically, that the idea of communication and deceit or trickery are very much like can be uh well in one archetype, in one character, one
Well,
person.
tune in next time, folks. Same bat time, same bat channel to hear me agree with everything that Mike just said
Hmm.
because we're gonna get into that
It actually
on the
reminds me,
sequel.
so this isn't this is not totally connected or whatever, but I always thought a similar irony. And if you are familiar with patron saints and the things that they're patrons for, so the Catholic Church will oftentimes associate a patron saint with or a saint with, like, he'll be the patron or she'll be the patron of something either associated with their death or some
Hmm.
ironic sort of thing. And
Yep.
the one that
Orthodoxy does it too.
oh
I do
yeah,
think it seems way more common in Catholicism in the sense that
there's
like
yeah.
I don't I feel like Catholics bring up patron saints for this or that more often than I hear Orthodox do it,
Uh-huh.
but it's 100% in the Orthodox tradition for sure.
Oh yeah, no, and I guess yeah, I wasn't meaning to exclude by any means, but the one example, which I think is more Catholic than Orthodox because he's somebody who comes up a little bit later, but I always thought it was ironic that Saint Anthony of Padua, Okay, so most
Hmm.
people know St. Anthony of Padua, besides the fact that he was a doctor of the church and called the Hammer of Heretics, but he's known as the patron saint of lost items. Okay, so keep that in
Okay.
mind. But he was also known as the patron saint of the mail, and so I was just like, oh, that's just like some backhanded like
Like the mails get
criticism.
lost.
Yeah,
Like yeah, someone.
isn't that the common like, and so
That's hilarious.
and so I was like, okay, somebody, has it out because the male lost some item of theirs, and then
Yeah,
that
and they
person
started
became
the
a bishop
rumor.
in the church, and
They
he's like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna like so
That's right. I want all you good Catholic postal workers to carry
yeah.
a pendant of St. Anthony of Padua. You know, I was in an icon writing class a couple years back, and they were doing St. Anthony of Padua
Oh, okay,
icons.
sure.
Yeah, there was some Orthodox in there, and we were doing different ones. But so yeah, that's my familiarity with that guy. Now I know a little bit more. So there you are.
So another interesting connection. So as we go through some of the other trickster characters, because we haven't even gotten to the modern ones yet, but some of the other more ancient ones, you have like the coyote in, I think it's like a more southwestern, like Native American mythology. You
Okay,
have
sure.
the raven in, that'd be like more northwest, Native
Like
American.
Pacific Northwest type stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And then
It's interesting because of that kind of connection to Norse. The Raven is so
oh, sure, with Odin,
iconographic for
yeah.
Norse stuff with Odin and things like that.
Well,
We could
and
probably talk about that a little bit, but
but then so actually those two, um they're both associated with the same thing. And even in
hey, you
Greek
know what?
mythology, what?
I bet you it's because they're like carrion birds. I bet you like the coyote is to
Yeah.
the American South what the raven is to northern climates, and that would be true even of like Norse areas like Norway and things like that. This idea is that the raven and the coyote are actually these carrion animals that go and steal other people's work and don't try for their sustenance, and they take advantage of other people in order to get that. And I suppose that's probably going to be what is the foundation for people starting to associate these animals with that type of treachery, right?
Yeah, so the deceit part is in there. The other part too is that so they it's this transition from like life and death. And actually going back to Hermes really quick, he was the one who could move about from Olympus to earth, right? He was the one who was moving from heaven to earth. And so the idea of
Mhm.
movement and speed, right? Because that's also Hermes, or in Roman mythology Mercury, which is why we named the planet Mercury, because it was the
Yeah,
fastest
because he's
moving, right?
fast, right? Or
But
like, obviously Flash, especially Jay Garrick, the original Flash, Silver Age Flash, he's kind of modeled on Hermes or
okay.
Mercury because speed is like his, what people associate. He's got the little winged boots.
Yeah, yeah.
Perseus gets the little winged boots. Doesn't Perseus get the little winged boots?
From is it from Hermes or
Yeah,
whatever?
from Hermes, I think.
Yeah.
I think,
Um,
because some of the gods go and help him when he goes to,
yeah.
do his whole myth thing. But
So to keep that idea of transition, right, and change, because again, that's the deeper when we're talking about definitions of the trickster, our characteristics, it's the catalyst for change, and they remain alive by feeding off the dead. And so you have this life and death.
well, what's kind of interesting about it though is that like so we were talking about the raven and the coyote being these carrying things, and you're bringing up the fact that Hermes is the one that can transition to the mortal plane and things like that.
And
But
Loki
even
changes his
Odin,
appearance too.
right? Well,
Yeah.
but even Odin has his ravens that are basically his kind of message bearers or guides, and
Yeah.
fly around and bring him information. But so they kind of, it's interesting to me that Odin has this carrion animal being his what is the word I'm looking for? Like I keep thinking forebear, but I'm not talking about a
Like a
forebear.
herald.
That's
Like a herald.
a herald.
Yeah.
That's the word I'm looking for.
Huh.
Yeah, like these kind of heralds, right? The idea that there's that kind of similarity between, something like natives in the Pacific Northwest and uh, that type of folklore over in like
Well,
Viking areas is
another
interesting.
so the other in like which another really interesting connection that I actually just came across just in getting ready for this, in getting ready for this, is so in both of those raven and coyote mythologies, they are associated with the stealing of light or the stealing of fire, or this, bringing light into the world from fire. So it's the stealing of fire and giving it to, just like Prometheus. It's the stealing of fire
Yeah, I
from
was
the
about to say,
gods and
well,
giving
that'll
it.
remind us of, right?
Yeah. And
Prometheus.
but what's interesting about, again, we've already talked about how one of the aspects of the trickster is this amoral, right? Not moral or immoral. And you can see the same sort of ambiguity in the nature of fire itself. Because what is fire has both its creative and its destructive elements. And so the
Mhm.
fact that they're associating these trickster characters, the coyote and the raven, with being this
Fire
carrier of with
bearers.
fire, yeah. And so again, it points to that. Okay, there's two sides to this, right? And it's going to bring about a change. Is that change going to be creative or destructive, right?
Mhm.
And so that's
Right, right.
another fascinating part of the trickster trope, which, as we'll continue to talk about, and as we'll see, um, obviously that's going to have implications for salvation history and for theology and stuff too.
Well, it absolutely will. And I'll be honest here, all joking aside, I'm trying to remember how much of this we cover in the sequel conversation, because I know we do a lot of biblical stuff
Yeah.
and start to get into it. And so I don't want to cover too much of it, because I feel like we actually get
Well,
there
we can
in the next
allude to it,
conversation.
because yeah, like
Yeah.
we definitely cover it in more depth. Here we're just going into the,
I think we spent a lot more time talking about like the stuff outside the biblical narrative in this conversation, right?
yeah, yeah.
And that, which is fine. And again, folks, for those of you who are listening, sorry to kind of be like letting you behind the curtain here, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that we do get to talk about. But frankly, there's a ton of stuff that we were bringing up in this conversation that is just coming to mind. Like
Well,
one of
and
the things that,
there's just so
or go
much
on,
in
Mike.
this. I mean, that's why we have two parts. So,
That's true. Yeah, we haven't even gotten to some of the favorite parts that we can maybe start talking about right
or
now.
even our favorite
Is
tricksters in pop culture, which, because we'll get
Well, I
to.
did bring up the mask.
Oh yeah, that's okay.
Or the
That's a Loki. That's a sub reference to
That's a
Loki.
Loki. Yeah, I
So,
know. That's
and
sub Loki.
if you don't mind,
But
there's
obviously
actually
the
one more
Joker, right?
ancient example that I want us to bring about, because this ancient trickster gives us another aspect of the trickster character of the trope, which is that even though we have this deceit and cunningness, it actually and a catalyst for change, it also brings about wisdom. Like, they become one of the changes that they become a catalyst for is this bringing about of wisdom. Now you see that a little bit in the bringing of fire, right? Because that
Mhm.
that speaks to, like, humans are able to grow and develop. Uh, but if you look at the so this is, I think it's West African is where Anansi comes from, the
Oh, sure,
spider,
sure.
and
I
he's
mean, and
another.
people No, and so that's an example that I would have brought up too. If anyone's familiar with American Gods by Neil Gaiman, I read it as a novel before it became a TV show. They made it into a pretty interesting TV show. There was only 2 seasons. I think it got canceled after season
Yeah,
2.
I can't quite remember. But no, I mean, the book is obvious. Anything Neil Gaiman does too. That's getting its own episode, by the way, as well. Just like the
Well,
whole American Gods thing.
you could do episodes on all kinds of. In fact, the local theater here is doing a showing of Coraline,
Oh yeah,
which was one
definitely.
of his. That's one of my favorite children's movies from the 21st century.
It's yeah.
Um,
No, I mean,
so I think I'm
Graveyard
gonna take
Book
my kids to
2
go
is
see that.
another.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do episodes on
No,
anything
Neil
that he
Neil
does.
Gaiman. I
Obviously,
mean, you
the
can't
elephant in the
have.
room is Sandman, and
Yeah,
which obviously there's the Netflix thing. So
we've had
maybe when
lots of
season 2.
conversations about Neil Gaiman stuff.
Oh, he's got a ton of content. He's really prolific. But anyway, yeah. So Anansi is a interesting character from American Gods, but obviously in the West African traditions, he's everything that you've just described, right? He's a
Well,
spider. He's a spider god too, I think, isn't he?
yeah, yeah. Um,
hmm
So what's one of the cool things that come, if you look at just like basic profiles, like if you were to just Google search like Anansi, or the Trickster or something like that, one of the characteristics is that he can transform apparent weakness into virtue, which there again, you already have that catalyst for change part, but that speaks to, again, if we're starting to tie this into the Christian tradition, that's the kind of unexpected.
Well, And
Go
here's the
ahead.
thing, and I do think that we talk about this quite a bit, but certainly we can allude to it. If you guys aren't kind of realizing that there's some interesting parallels between this idea of a divine figure, quote unquote, a demigod type figure, introducing knowledge to humans, um, for better or for worse,
Yeah.
right? What does that remind you of
Mm-hmm.
in the biblical tradition,
I feel
in the
like there's a
Christian
tree
faith?
involved too.
Yeah, it just sounds vaguely familiar, doesn't it? And obviously, within Christianity, the idea of the serpent tricking Adam and Eve into eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is universally kind of perceived as this negative events.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, I think it would be true of both Catholic and Orthodox traditions. It's definitely talked about in the Orthodox tradition
Oh, happy fault.
that
Is that what you're?
well, not that's
Yeah.
not you can go there,
Yeah.
which fits really, really well with what you were saying. What I was about to say was that they were always destined to um, have that fruit. They just weren't ready for it. And
Mm-hmm.
so the great fall, the great sin of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life. I'm mixing this up. I'm a bad
No,
Christian.
yeah, tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, you're.
Yeah. But it was not that God was saying, "Oh, because obviously there's this idea that well, they need something to abide by in order for them to demonstrate fidelity, demonstrate their faithfulness. So this idea exists that God created a rule for them to follow, just so that they could follow it.
Uh,
That was certainly kind of my perception back when I was a Protestant and things like that. And there's merit to it. It's not that there's,
Obedience
free
is a
will does
virtue. It's not
require,
the
yeah,
virtue.
free will requires choice, right? And so it's not completely, without value, but it's a little bit more superficial than it needs to be. That there's also this idea in classical Christianity that the biggest problem was that they did it against God's will because they weren't ready for it. But that God wasn't trying to keep things from them. God wasn't trying to be arbitrary with them. He was just, they were young. They were children, childlike. They
Mm.
were naive. And so the catalyst for change, kind of like what you were saying, oh happy fault.
Yeah, so that's a quote
Go
from
ahead and talk to that.
Saint Augustine. It's also a line in the Exultet, which the deacon would sing at the Easter Vigil Mass every year. So
Hmm.
the Easter Vigil, we say, "Oh happy fault, which brought for us so great a Redeemer." And so,
Hmm.
in one sense, right? Obviously, nobody would look at the event itself as an objectively good thing, but the
Yeah,
result from it.
disobedience is not good. As St.
Yeah.
Paul says, shall we continue to sin that grace may abound? God forbid, right? But the idea is that nothing is an accident in God's providence, in God's plan here.
Well, in this
As
again, in terms of tying it into kind of full circle, right? Who's the ultimate trickster when it talks about bringing about an event or a catalyst for change? It all gets brought right, or it all gets brought to God's glory. And so
Mhm,
we
you're right.
spoiler alert,
It's not that
Jesus is
God
the
was
ultimate trickster, right?
surprised.
Yeah.
God wasn't surprised. God didn't get tricked, right? And I do think we talk more about this in the sequel conversation. But there is a lot of meat to this idea that Satan himself gets tricked, right?
Yeah.
At the end
Yeah.
of the day.
Well, and
But we'll let that
well,
conversation
that's
be
actually
for next time.
so moving on to our modern examples of tricksters, one of the
Well,
things that
actually,
you will see is
all right.
that the trickster character gets his comeuppance. He gets tricked, like he gets
Mhm.
outsmarted. And the first example, again, when I say modern, like we're talking in the last 100, 200 or so years, but the gingerbread man is actually a trickster trope. That's a
Got the
trickster story.
gumdrop buttons.
Okay, so not that modern, but in the classic gingerbread man tale,
Uh-huh.
right? He is the trickster.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah,
yet
yeah.
what happens is he gets and it's by another trickster trope, because you remember who
Yeah.
tricks
He
him,
done gets ate by the
and it's a
fox.
fox, who again is another
The fox eats
classic
him.
trickster character.
Mhm.
So it's almost like you have these two, meeting, and the trickster from the entire story, the gingerbread man, gets out tricked. He rides on the fox's back across the river, then the fox
Yep.
eats him.
Well, and that also reminds me of another similar story from folklore where I think it's a frog who gives a scorpion a ride across the river. But here's
Yep.
the thing: the scorpion. So I forget actually what culture this comes from. I don't know if it's native to the Americas. It might be an Eastern thing actually. I just forget where I've heard this. But anyway, Frog's on the riverbed. Scorpion needs to get across the river. Frog's like, "Hey man, you're gonna sting me if I take you across the river." Scorpion's like, "No, I would never do that. Then we would both die." And then the frog's like, "Okay, I guess the logic follows."
Mm-hmm.
So he goes ahead and lets the scorpion get on his back. He's going. They're halfway across the river. Scorpion stings him. And as they're both sinking into the abyss, into their inevitable deaths, the frog's like, "Why would you do that, buddy?"
I gotta
And
be me.
the scorpion's like,
I ca-
which of us is the frog and which of us is the scorpion in this?
yeah.
I'll let the audience decide. But the scorpion's like, "It's in my nature." I'm
Uh-huh.
like, what can I say? Hey, I'm tricky.
Well, and what's funny is that like one of the big theological themes that we're sort of slowly making our way towards is the idea of providence, right? Because one of the big things that we've been talking about is, like you said, God's not outsmarted, God's not out tricked. Even
Yeah,
the tricks that take place within the story are brought about in the long run towards God's will, towards God's ends.
sure. Well,
And
let me build off that because there's a few examples that I actually really want to talk about that we kind of glossed over or didn't get to, but we can just bring it back. But it kind of builds off of what you're getting at here, and it's going to lay into it. And that's Merlin, right?
yeah,
Merlin from the Arthurian legends.
definitely, yeah.
So La Morte d'Arthur, La Morte d'Art, I don't say foreign words well, everybody. La Morte d'Arthur. It's French.
You're doing
He
great.
yeah, I know, right? That's like kind of the penultimate tale of the Arthurian like corpus, right? There's a number of different sources for Arthur tales, but this is a particularly famous one and a particularly robust one. And Merlin's a character in that. And he is absolutely this kind of trickster catalyst
Mhm.
in that story, right? And he's famously kind of ambiguous as to like his morality is in question. Um, that story begins uh with him going to Uther Pendragon, Arthur's dad, and Arthur's dad, Uther, is in love with a married woman, who's his enemy. And Merlin's like, "Hey, I know how you can get with her. I'll change you into the likeness of her
Oh, change in
husband,
appearance again,
and
yeah,
then you
it's
can sneak in and
so
do
deceit
what you want
too.
to do with her.
Yeah.
And the only thing is in return for this, I get to keep the baby."
So
Right?
it's like making
So
it's
basically,
classic making
Uther.
a deal with the devil sort of thing,
Yes,
you
it
know?
is. It's fascinating because we don't really associate Merlin as typically he's considered like like we think he's more like
We
Gandalf than
wanna turn
anything
him
else,
into a
right?
good guy when in
Right.
reality, he's supposed to be that sort of
He's fairly
catalyst for
ambiguous.
change,
Yeah.
amoral trickster character. Um,
Well, and it's interesting because we keep saying amoral, and that's an accurate word to use, but I'll put a little nuance on it. And this is really demonstrated. Like John Borman did a movie on the Arthurian legend called Excalibur, and it came out in the late 70s or early 80s. I don't know. I'm gonna guess 81 or something like that. But it's probably the most faithful rendition of Arthur on film, right? There's been a bunch of examples of Arthur on film, but this one really leans into the Lamort d'Arthur novel. Um, and the character who plays Merlin in that is great, but he's also basically like an ambassador for the land. John Borman
I'm
bakes a
too
bunch of
young to
kind of
get
like
this
hippie.
reference.
You haven't seen this one?
No, I
He
haven't.
he bakes a bunch of kind of like hippie stuff into. You can tell the one thing that's true about Lamort d'Arthur is that it's uh full of medieval culture, right? And so there's a lot of reference to Christianity and things like that.
Mhm.
But Excalibur doesn't include any of that. He's doing something. He's trying to be faithful to it, but he's putting this kind of 70s new agey spin on it. the way that the hippies spun Tolkien
Yeah.
to be kind of like a new agey thing. And Merlin is this kind of like um incarnation of the land in it, right? And so the reason why I bring that up is would you call nature amoral? And it's like, yeah, sure, right? I mean, like there's nothing wrong with calling
Well,
nature
and it
amoral.
speaks to that unpredictability element, right? Which is what the trickster always has. And that's why it's been associated with fire. But to go to your point, what's the new fire according to the Arthurian legends? Well, that's magic. Magic is that same element, just like in the ancient mythologies, fire had that, unpredictability. It could be a creative or a destructive force. Now,
Sure.
what's always the story whenever magic is involved? It's, oh, is magic going to be used for good or for bad? Is it going to be a creative or a destructive thing? And so it's the same,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's like the same, element, so to speak.
No, yeah, I could see that. The and I don't know, like so when we start talking about things like magic and things like that, you could go a lot of different ways. We could have a whole episode just talking about magic as such, right? And how it's used across things. It's a little simplistic, to talk about like black magic and white magic and all that. I think it gives a little bit too much credit to
Oh, yeah.
the
This is just an aside.
practitioners,
This isn't meant to be a whole
that like
rabbit
yeah,
trail, certainly.
right. Well, anyway, but so Merlin is this. He's everything that we are describing as a trickster character in the Lamort d'Arthur story. And fun fact, he doesn't last very long. Fun fact, he dies off relatively quickly within
You
the
wouldn't think of
context
it,
of
yeah.
that story. Yeah, no, you always like even Borman's film take on it keeps him around towards the second half of the movie, but he does that by taking the elements of the story that happen much earlier in the
Mm,
novel, and just moving it to the back of the film.
flashbacks or whatever.
Right. Well, it's not a
Um,
flashback. He just keeps him alive longer. But what happens to Merlin takes place early in the novel. And which is to say he gets tricked, which is to say that he himself
there's always
basically
that
gets conned
comeuppance.
into, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So it rolls into everything that we've described with
Well,
the,
and
the
I,
whole trickster thing.
I like so the Merlin example, not only is there the more ancient, right, like you were describing, but then we both have experienced a return of Merlin in the C.S. Lewis space trilogy. Did you finished that
Oh
Hideous
yeah, no,
Strength,
I
right?
did. I did. Yeah, I totally finished that hideous strength. And you're right, Merlin becomes actually. So I knew that Merlin was going to be a character in that hideous strength before I got there. Um, but I didn't know how that was going to play. It feels such a weird inclusion to put Merlin into what's ostensibly a science fiction series, right? Um, but of course, Lewis is kind of outside boundaries like that,
Well,
and it's more of a fairy tale, I suppose, for adults, as he phrased it. But no, he addresses this head on in that hideous strength, where Merlin is uh considered kind of an amoral agent, but he's one that ultimately understands that he's beholden to Melildil,
yeah,
the
he kind of
god.
becomes a good guy in that one too, certainly.
Well, he becomes a it's not it's and I would say that, like, it's not that he becomes a good guy, he kinda stays who he is. He just knows his place in the hierarchy,
Uh-huh.
like, and I'm pretty sure the novel even says that he could have been brought into the services of the bad people. But
Well,
at any rate, he is always aware of the ultimate good and the fact that the ultimate good is kind of the people who win. That's the impression one
it's
gets.
the same sort of element as we've been going through, the catalyst for change, whether it's the techne of fire or the magic of fire, right? Because ancient peoples, like there were ancient peoples who worshipped fire because it had this sort of magical or otherworldly element,
Oh,
not just the
yeah.
creative and the destructive part, but it was something that you associated movement with life. And fire, as long as fire was burning, it was always moving. And so you saw this living element to it, but it wasn't like anything
Well,
alive that you'd ever seen before.
why
And
can't I
so
think of what was the, pagan religion that was from the Middle East that, basically, like, the Persians either
oh,
adopted or It's a famous one. I
I mean,
can't
you're not
think of the name
talking
for some reason.
Zoroastrianism, are you?
No, I actually am. No,
Oh,
that's it.
okay.
Yeah,
Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
Well, but they have a huge element of fire worship, I believe, and they're also famously dualistic, right?
Uh-huh.
Zoroastrianism is a
And there again,
famously
that's just
dualistic,
another, yeah, it's another kind of
but fire
trickster.
is a huge part of their ritual, I think. I'm a little rusty, folks. I mean, look into it yourself, but I'm pretty sure that's true.
You were probably talking about Game of Thrones, right? With the whole
Yeah,
fire.
that's I'm mixing up fiction and reality
That's
again.
just it. Yep.
It
Yeah.
happens all the
A
time.
lot of fire
But
stuff in
yeah,
Game
Game
of
of
Thrones.
Thrones.
A lot of fire
Yeah, Game
stuff.
of Thrones does. Yeah.
So no, but
It's
there
funny
again,
though.
I
That's
mean,
their version of Christianity. George
oh,
R. R. Martin's version of
there.
Christianity is this
So
kind of fire worship
we've
religion.
had off the record conversations of like all of the at least on the surface Christian elements to the symbols, to the visible symbols in that series, especially how it's played out in the TV series, but then obviously same thing with the books. So yeah, that could, we keep saying, oh, that could be an episode, that could be an episode. Yes, there's lots of different episodes we could do. Just, let's just keep it one thing at a time. We'll stay focused on this one.
One of Mike's hobby horses is trying to redeem Game of Thrones for
Okay. You know what?
Christian audiences. Keep trying.
I'm not even
Keep
going to take
trying,
that
Mike.
bait, Jacob. So the last thing, and we're kind of coming up to the close of our introduction of
Yeah.
of trickster characters. But the last thing I wanted to highlight, that the trickster will oftentimes, the role that he'll play within the story, he or she, I should say, but is they're going to be a reflection of the hero's faults. And we've had a conversation like this when we were talking about Batman and how all of the Batman villains are sort of like
for sure.
one aspect of Batman taken to its extreme, like it's reflecting that
Yep.
part of it to an extreme.
Or an inversion, but still
Yeah.
a reference to,
And
right?
so-
I mean, so
And
it's always in relationship to the qualities of Batman.
But we see this especially in the Marvel version of Loki. But again, all the tricksters do this, is that they'll reflect back the faults or the sins or whatever of the hero character. And so Loki very much is a subversion of what makes Thor, right? Thor is all about strength, whereas Loki is all about cunning. Thor is, very much the violent conflict character, whereas Loki is always the one who will try to get out of stuff. And so
this is super archetypal stuff too, by the way. So in other words, to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, the idea, and even all the way back to our earliest conversations about like the hero's journey and things like that.
Yeah.
We did a brief aside about feminine symbolism and masculine symbolism.
Okay.
And, Thor, basically everything that you attribute to Thor is this like masculinity ultimately. And I'm talking in like a Jungian archetypal sense.
Yeah.
Where he's in the open, he's outright, he's forward. If his solution to something is to punch it, right?
And we see
all
that
stuff.
in the first Thor movie, the Marvel Thor movie.
For sure,
too. Like they played out really
and
well.
he keeps that throughout, that persona throughout, but yeah, it's definitely in the first one for sure. When they're laying the foundation for these character traits. Then obviously Loki's inversion of all that is actually going to fall under the kind of feminine archetype where it's subtle and it's, it works behind the scenes.
Which is funny too,
it's-
that, in the Loki series, there was all this big controversy about a Loki character being played by like a woman version of Loki. Do you kind of remember when the Loki series came out? And
I haven't actually watched the series. I do vaguely remember there being some kind of,
I did see it, and I remember thinking,
kerfluffle
wow,
about
this was
that.
much ado about nothing, to be honest. But anyway, it speaks to your point that was one of the big things in that short Marvel series, and I think there is going to be a season 2, but that the other Loki, right? There was the Tom Hiddleston Loki that we all know from the movies, but then the other Loki was it was played by a woman. It was a woman character, and it's like,
does the female Loki constantly one up the male Loki? Yeah. See, I haven't even seen the show, but I bet you she does, Mike.
I honestly,
Anyway.
I don't remember looking for that sort of thing. I wasn't, I was trying to keep it non-agenda driven, but I just want to enjoy
Hey,
art for
actually,
art's
hey, let's
sake.
be real. Let's be real. I suppose that even that would maybe lean into everything I just said.
No, certainly.
If you're going to have a superior Loki character, I guess making it a woman makes sense.
What was the quote unquote curse in Genesis 3, right? Your desire will be after your husband. So it's like it's the whole men are from Mars, women from Venus thing all over again. This is not a
Which I
new,
completely no, yeah.
this is
Which
not
even
new.
that's astrological symbolism, is it not? Like
Um,
we're talking about Venus and Mars and things like that.
yeah.
Again, it's all which I like to play in these ideas, right? I think that
Mhm.
ultimately we need to be formed by our Christian traditions and things like that.
But now
But I
you're
don't think
able
that the
to.
Christian traditions exclude what can be understood by these other facets
Well, no,
that's
one of the whole points of this, why what we wanted to do on this podcast was it's almost like what are the strictly human foundations to what, what's the nature that grace is going to build upon. And
Mhm,
so we've kind of laid down in human mythology, human history, here is all of this, like, what are they recognizing about human nature? And how it became
right.
these certain tropes, and one of these tropes being the trickster. Now, what we're going to see um, in the next, in part two, is what are the elements of grace? How did grace lay upon these trickster tropes, right? We talked about the amoral, the catalyst for change, the reflection of the hero's faults, especially, right? Reflection of the hero's pride, oftentimes, how that
Yep,
trickster
yep.
role plays that. And so all of those things, right? All those elements are going to be just as present, not just in the, pagan mythology, whether it's ancient pagan or modern pagan mythology, but in the Christian mythology, first in the Old Testament, and then, how it's brought about to its fulfillment in the New Testament, right? Who's the ultimate trickster, and how
Mhm.
does that sort of come about? Does that make,
No, we talk about a lot of really, really interesting stuff in the sequel conversation. This, so, if this was a bit awkward to try to replicate and not step on the toes of where we go next, it'll be worth it.
oh no, I think
So
I did a
check out
great
what we
job. No.
do. Yeah, I'm not sure I did. But the one thing that we didn't get to, I was gonna try to insert it into this conversation, and we never got to it. Was Robin Hood's another really good example of
Oh
my
yeah,
son
sure.
started reading Robin Hood,
Well, and in the
and
Disney
it's like, "Oh, you
version,
know what?
what
That's got a
animal
trickster
is
thing."
represents Robin Hood?
He
Yeah,
is. Yes,
yeah.
that's one of my favorite
I know.
cartoons
No, it's a
too.
good
I didn't
one. It
even
takes me back. It's been
this
a
is one of the
while.
best, yeah.
Oh, play us out. Play us out, Jacob. You keep going. I'm gonna keep talking. So, if you guys enjoyed this conversation, just like I said again, rate, give us a 5-star rating, like, subscribe, leave a positive response, so that Jacob can just keep on singing. Keep on singing.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram